Hello, Brent.
Hello, Stephen.
uh, Today, we're joined by Brent Eviston, an arts educator that many of you watching this will probably already know. Brent's taught countless artists, both online and in person, and we're glad to have his course, The Art and Science of Figure Drawing on Proko. Brent's going to be doing a little bit more of a structured live stream today than we've done on some of these live streams in the past. So bust out your notebooks, your different note-taking materials, your sketchbooks, your lined papers, and follow along as he delivers this free lesson. Brent, what are we covering today?
All right, well, today I am focusing on shading the figure.
Okay.
So to do that, I'm going to start off by showing some finished figure drawings, and then I'm going to give a very quick and simple demonstration where I'm going to take you through the 5-step value scale that I use and show you the basic shading process on a sphere. So I'm going to do a quick demo, and then after that, I'm going to spend at least an hour, if not more, actually shading a figure drawing and
Okay.
apply that shading process to the figure. So
Okay.
that's what we're going to be focusing on today. And I would encourage people to jump in with any questions, and particularly how I can make what I'm teaching relevant to your viewers.
Okay. Yeah. You guys in the chat, please feel free, stack up some questions. If you guys can do me a favor, just start them with a little cue so I can see them a little bit easier. Just identify you guys talking amongst yourselves or looking to reach out to Brent. We'll kind of hit some little points throughout the stream where we'll kind of pepper in those questions. I know that you're leading something that's a little more structured, like we said a little bit earlier. So we'll find some rest points for them.
Okay.
All right, I'm gonna bring up your stage here.
Yes. Okay.
Let's show your artboard.
All right. So are we up? Yes, there
Yeah.
we go. Okay. So to start off, I just wanted to show a more traditional figure drawing. So this drawing was done on white paper with a dark pencil. Now, this is the way most people shade most of the time, but what we're going to focus on in this live stream is actually how to shade on toned paper or colored paper. So that means instead of just using one dark pencil for all of the values, the paper is going to stand in for a value. There's going to be a dark pencil for the shadow values, and then a white pencil for the lit areas. So to start off, I know Stephen asked me to show some finished work. So I'm going to take a little time and go over some finished drawings that I have here. So I do tend to work mostly with traditional materials. I have done some digital drawing, but I really love to work traditional. I really like the feel of the materials in my hand. So this is an example of a drawing that is done on a sort of a warm colored paper. It's kind of a mid-tone value, again with a red pencil and then white pencil for the highlights. So I'm going to do a huge amount of drawing in this live stream, but I wanted to start off just by talking about some of the ideas that we're going to be focusing on. So one thing that is critical is that every drawing you're going to see in this live stream was done using with the object or the model being drawn was lit with a single light source. And that is such a critical decision to make about your work, and it's often overlooked. And so one thing I have in my notes to really hit hard is one of the most important decisions you're going to make about your drawing happens before the pencil ever hits the page. It is how you are lighting your subjects. So one of the reasons that I love using a single light source is it tends to create a full range of values on the page. So when you look at a drawing like this, we have bright highlights, we have some really gorgeous mid-tone shadows, we have dark core shadows, and very dark cast shadows. And so, one of the most common issues I see, particularly with beginners, is they tend not to think too critically about how their subject is lit. So this is something I want people to start to think about right away. How is your subject lit? And lighting something with a single light source does an incredible job at a full range of values. So nearly every drawing you're going to see, if not every drawing, I tend to have a lighting style. I like to light my subjects with the light coming from above to the front and from the left, meaning that the upper left of everything that you're going to be seeing is going to be in the light, and the lower right of the parts of the subject are going to be in shadow. Now, of course, there are different ways you can use a single light source, but I think it's so important to draw from life whenever you can. And whenever you're drawing, it doesn't take fancy lighting. Like, you can do this with a simple desk lamp. But when I started off lighting my own objects, you can get a simple sphere or a box or a ball or a can or whatever, and just get a desk lamp, throw a light on it, and look for this kind of lighting. So a couple other notes here. You'll notice that somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of the subject is in the light, and only about 1/3 to 1/4 is in shadow. And it creates such a beautiful three-dimensional effect to these kinds of drawings. So
it seems like we have a technical issue here.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, what we're seeing here in the stream is not currently matching what's being shown to the crowd.
Okay.
Yeah, here in StreamYard. So I'm gonna try to sort this out here.
Okay.
Yeah, hold.
Okay.
Sorry, to the crowd. Yeah, they were saying something and I couldn't understand, because what we see here in StreamYard should be exactly what they're seeing, but that is apparently not the case right now.
Huh. Okay.
Okay. Well, now they say that they can see things right, but
okay. Great.
I have fear, so
yeah,
I want to make sure.
If there's anything you need me to do, let me know.
I think it seems good now. That was really weird. Sorry about that, guys. Yeah, what we've seen here should be exactly what you see. It's fixed in the meantime. Let me know if it pops up again. But yeah, otherwise, Brent, please feel free to tell people about the importance of separating highlights and shadows.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Yes. And could they hear what I was saying?
Yeah, everything you were saying was great. It was just the image was pretty small in there. It was kind of like your window and the drawing window were flipped.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So
all right.
If you want to start over again, feel free.
Sure.
Otherwise, feel free to plow ahead.
I will do just a very brief summary. So I was saying that all of the subjects you're going to see have been lit with a single light source that's coming from above, from the left, and to the front of the subjects, which creates a beautiful full range of values from highlights to rich dark shadows. So yeah, single source lighting. If you're not lighting your own subjects, if you're not practicing that way, I highly recommend it. So yeah, I just wanted to show a few other drawings. Now, one thing I want to note is that the drawings that I'm going to show you today are going to be on different colors of paper. So this drawing was done with a black pencil and white pencil on this, kind of beautiful, warm brown paper. Here, this paper is a little more on the yellow end. It was done with a red pencil. So I wanted to talk a little bit about pairing pencils with paper. So, one of my favorite colors to work with, or my color combinations, is, a yellow or orange paper with this kind of dark red pencil. And I think it creates such a beautiful warmth, particularly for figure drawings. And I think whenever you're trying to pair a particular color of pencil with a piece of paper, I really encourage you you want to get a pencil that is dark enough to read as value. So for example, this is a red pencil that I'm using, but it's not a really bright high chroma red. It is, it's got some depth to it. So when you create shadows, they read as shadows. It doesn't read as color. So that's a theme that we're going to talk quite a bit about. So again, I'm just going to continue to show some finished work. And if anybody has any questions about these particular drawings, please feel free to ask. So here we have yet another kind of paper. So this drawing, whenever I use bluish papers, I tend to like to draw with a dark brown pencil. So it's not quite as harsh as a black pencil can be. So yeah, but once again, very subtle highlights here. But you can see the paper, starting off with a color or a value of paper, the paper tends to do so much of the work of establishing midtones.
There was one question I think that you're addressing right now. But I wanted to be able to address exactly how they phrased this. So it's like Rad Plays Guitar asked, do you use toned paper to make it easier to represent midtones than push the shadows with pencil and the highlights with chalk? Do you have any paper brand recommendations?
Yes. So the white of the page can be a very overwhelming thing to deal with because you tend to be responsible for every single value. And one of the things I love, actually, let me put a drawing with white paper with red pencil. So these were both done with the same pencil. And actually, I want to note the colors tend to look different on the white paper versus the this paper. They look like different pencils. But what you have here is the warmth of this page coming through. And because this page is darker, it makes the pencil appear darker. So yeah, I mean, just looking at this, one might assume that these were done with different colored pencils, but they were both done with this exact pencil. Now, so you can see here that, yeah, the paper stands in for the midtones, whereas in this drawing, in the midtone areas, I have to add them all. I mean, they're both wonderful ways to draw. I do a lot of both. They're just different. And I think that, a lot of beginners in particular tend to default to drawing with white paper and a dark pencil. And part of what I want to do in this live stream is just encourage people, try it out. This is such an amazing way to draw. And in some ways it can be easier, although that's not why I do it. The reason I love it is because of the warmth. It just adds this other layer to these drawings. I think that particularly when you start throwing in, some of the white pencil, these drawings on colored paper or toned paper, they start to glow in a way that drawings on white paper often don't do. So I think it's just a really beautiful effect that you can get. So in terms of specific materials, he was asking about paper. So I am terrible with pronunciation, so bear with me. But this is a Canson, I think it's Mitientes paper. Yeah, so Canson Mitientes paper. It comes in a wide range of colors. And in fact, every single drawing you're going to see in this live stream was done on that paper. The specific color of this paper is called hemp. It's one of my very favorites, and it is often difficult to find, and I personally take blame for that because I often buy it in bulk when I find it. So if you go on Blick and it's not there, I recently made an order. So
you guys know where to find it. You just have to find out where Brent lives and then go get it there.
That's right.
There was a question here. This isn't strictly a materials thing.
Yes.
But Haikai is how I'm choosing to say this. They said, do you only work from live models, or do you use a reference or a specific site for references? Could you recommend any for people who do not have access to live models?
Yes. So I work from live models when I can. At this point in my career, I tend to create my own photo reference. And so all of the drawings that you're seeing here were from a live session that I did with the model. These are all models that I know and work with. I photograph them, and then I will often start a drawing live, but then finish it from a photographic reference. And one thing I want to note about these poses is these would be nearly impossible to hold for any more than 10, maybe 15 minutes.
Yeah.
And so, and those are the kinds of poses that I love to draw. I love poses that are dynamic, that look like the figure was caught in mid-motion. I don't know if I'm successful at this. You can all let me know. But my goal with these drawings is to give the appearance that they could pop into motion at any moment. And so you'll see that I tend to be a little loose and at times wild with my gesture marks, with some of the shading marks. They often extend past the figure. I tend to draw pretty quickly, which you'll see some of today, is I think it kind of brings the drawing to life. I don't do slow, meticulous drawings that look like they're frozen. I like there to be some motion. I almost like there to be a sense of motion blur at times.
Yeah, I think it's definitely here, especially with the areas where you've decided to push something into the background. It's a good touch for this. Like even that area, you blend it with motion, going from that pushed area where you have the lost edges,
right,
and actually having lines go to that other leg. It encourages the perception of motion for both of those legs. It's good.
Yeah, and it's also it's that atmospheric perspective as well. The things that are closer to the viewer, things that I want emphasis on. There are really dark, hard lines, and things that are further away. I try to think like a camera. They start to go out of focus. They start to get blurry, and at times almost disappear entirely. So yeah. So here we have. Oh, go ahead.
I think I interrupted you while talking about pencils.
Oh,
I wanted to let
yes.
you get back to that one.
Yeah. The pencils I use. I really like this brand Lyra. And they're a German company, and I use their Rembrandt Polycolor pencils. They are an oil-based colored pencil. They are smooth, they're creamy. They don't smudge or smear that much. So I would say 90% of my drawings with these pencils. For white pencil, I tend to use these Faber-Castell Polychromos pencils. So I like these for whites. Now, if I'm drawing a highlight, this tends not to happen on figures, but if I'm drawing a highlight on a highly reflective object, I actually tend to use, actually I have one here, the Derwent drawing pencil in white. So yeah, so these are the materials I tend to use. So Canson paper, Lyra pencils, and Faber-Castell pencils. So here we have a drawing on blue paper, and once again, even with the cooler paper, the highlights start to glow and kind of get a fleshy appearance. So I'm going to demo all of this in just a few minutes. So yeah, so let me finish up with a couple other drawings here that I wanted to share. So once again, this blue paper. And again, I think this is a good example of trying to get a figure that looks like it's in mid-motion. And yeah, one thing that beginners often get concerned about is they often want to finish everything edge to edge. And so I just kind of like to encourage people, like, leave parts of it off. You don't have, a finished drawing does not mean that every possible detail is included. And we're going to talk about that today in the live stream as well. So yeah, any other thoughts or additional questions on, this is a partially finished drawing here, but yeah, anything else I can provide in terms of materials or finished work before we get into the demo?
For materials here, I think the main other one, well, I guess there's two that have come up.
Yeah.
Reza was asking, do you ever blend the pencil with the stump? Which is ironic because this is one question that you specifically said you're okay with answering before.
Yes, I don't. And so as a teacher, I always want to let people know that there's the way I do things, and then there aren't correct answers to this. And I never want students or viewers to hear that because I'm saying something means it's the right way to do it. You don't have to follow this, but I'll give my quick philosophy on this. I like drawings to look like drawings. I have done some hyperrealism or photorealism before, and but I want the drawings to look like drawings. So I like all of these individual lines and marks visible. And I think they add so much texture to a drawing, so much detail. And when you look at a drawing like this, my hope is that you can really see these thousands of individual lines and marks coming together. I think that when you're able to look at a drawing and see the illusion of life coming on the page, but then you're at the same time, you start to see these individual lines and strokes, it makes the viewer of a drawing part of crafting this illusion with me. They have to partake in the experience of the illusion of life emerging on the page in a way that you're kind of shut out from if there's way too much detail or every shadow is kind of blended into oblivion. It stops looking like a drawing. So I like to let my lines really stand out on the page. Now, if I'm perfectly honest, I have a bad habit of not always lifting my hand off of the page when I draw. This may be shocking to some of you. And but one of the things I like is that it tends to kind of push back and soften some of the shadows just a little bit. And I've kind of come to like the aesthetic that creates. So, in many ways, this would be considered, a horrible mistake or failure on my part to not always, lift my hand off. But, be an artist, be creative, make it yours. So many of the things that you'll be told not to do in your career, you may find out that those are just the things that make your drawings uniquely yours. So.
Absolutely. Is there anything that you think? So people have a tendency when they look at people whose work that they admire, that they want to try to do some sort of version of a master study of or incorporate the style of that person into theirs.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, is there something about you leaving your hand on the page and having this kind of like smudging kind of thing that you would recommend against someone not doing early in their art journey?
Sure. So a few notes on that. One is that the paper and pencils that I'm using allow for it. If I were using charcoal, I would destroy every drawing that I wouldn't lift my hand.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I was saying earlier that these Lyra Rembrandt polycolor pencils don't smear very much. And so the materials can take it. And with these particular materials, the smudging on this page tends to be minimal and just adds a kind of softness and knocks some shadows back in a way that I think enhances the drawing. Whereas if you were using any other materials, like I said, like charcoal, like softer pencils, even graphite, it might be a bad idea to do that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it really depends. For beginners, again, this is a tricky thing. I suppose I would say if you're learning, then the traditional way of always keeping your hand off the page is an important skill to have. I just don't, obviously I love traditional, master style figure drawing,
Certainly.
but I also don't think anybody should be beholden to all traditions. And I would encourage people to break the rules.
Yeah. There was only one last question here for materials before we get into it.
Yes.
So Esteban was asking, is there any way to erase these kinds of pencils, or must you stay committed to every strike you make?
Well, I'll give an in-between answer. Yes, they erase, not very well. So, yeah, and I will demonstrate that later on. So, one of the benefits of graphite is that it erases great, even with often pretty poor erasers. Like you can get 95% of graphite off the page. With these materials, I would say that you could probably, if you do a dark line, it's something you're kind of bearing down on the page, you could probably get about 75% of it off.
Okay.
But one thing I will say though is that again, I often feel like if you're at the beginning, like I don't know, if you look close on drawings like these, like there are all kinds of errant lines all over the place. And again, I like drawings to look like drawings. I don't mind people seeing me think through a problem. And so, you can see here, like, again, maybe this is a silly thing to do on a live stream, but, I don't know how well these cameras will pick this up, but here was my, first attempt at this contour, and I drew it dark and overconfidently, and I ended up having to erase it, and it's still here. And same thing, you can see this whole contour, I kind of had to thicken the figure at some point. That happens. But at the end of the day, I think, many of your viewers may know this, but these kinds of lines are often referred to as pentimenti. They're the thought process and the actual process of drawing left bare on the page. And I think they make a drawing more beautiful and interesting. Again, I like the idea of, to me, this is kind of similar to, looking at a writer's typewritten sheet that has all of these kind of like hand notations on. You see the hand of the artist, you see the thought process. I like to leave them in drawings. I don't like drawings that are too clean or too pristine. I like them a little wild. I like the thought process left on the page, even when my first attempts were incorrect.
Yeah, I think this is why a lot of times people end up liking the sketch more than some final finished inked or painted piece.
Yeah.
Because there's an implied movement with some of those misplaced lines. I'm going to hand this over to you now. If you guys have any questions in the chat, please feel free. It'll take us a little bit to get to them, but if there's something that pops up, I'll make sure to ask it. Brent, let's do this.
All right, let's do this. So as I said, if you've come in a little late, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do a quick demonstration of a 5-step value scale and the shading process. I'm going to do it on a sphere. hopefully I'm going to get this done in 10 to 15 minutes. And then for the rest of the live stream, I'm going to be actually shading a figure drawing. So we're going to deal with the shading process of values simply here first, and then we're going to apply it to a much more complex subject, the human figure. So first, a value scale. Now, whenever you're drawing on toned or colored paper, I always recommend creating a value scale. This helps you figure out how the values are going to look and work on that particular color of paper. So now I tend to use and recommend a 5-step value scale. Now, there are so many different value scales out there. Some of them have 9 steps, some 10, I've seen 12. I've even seen value scales that have up to 20 values. Some of them, the number 1 is the lightest value. Some of them, the number 1 is the darkest value. So what I've tried to do just for myself, but it's also really worked for many of my students, is to simplify the value scale down to 5 steps. And in this 5-step value scale, each of the values corresponds to a specific light or shadow condition. So it's a very lean and simplified value scale that I think makes so much sense. So that's what we're going to focus on. So first, I want to take you through this value scale. So the number 1 value, and again, it's just how I use it. Sometimes in other people's value scales, it may be numbered differently, but the number 1 value is a bright white. That is going to be your highlight value. And you can see that value here on the sphere. This is the brightest value. This is the only place in a drawing where we will fully bring the value up to a bright white, is that highlight. Value number 2 is the midtone value. So that on this blue paper, it has a little bit of light or white pencil in it, but you can see that value is found here. So that is that midtone value. Now, there are ways of thinking about value where you can literally have many, many values and gradations between 1 and 2. But again, I'm trying to promote a very simple and lean way of thinking about light and shadow and the shading process overall. So those are the 2 values that we have in the light. So earlier I talked about this idea of the lighting objects with a single light source. So hopefully you can see this sphere was lit that way. And so we have the upper left of this sphere in getting direct light from the light source. And there is a moment where the sphere curves away from the light source and goes into shadow. So values 1 and 2 are only going to be found on that lit side of the sphere. So now the other 3 values are in shadow. So starting with the darkest value, value number 5 is our cast shadow value. And really that darkest value, that number 5 value, you're only going to find it in the occlusion shadow, the darkest part of the cast shadow. So you can see that only occurs right here. And the further you get away from an object that's casting the shadow, the lighter the cast shadow will get as ambient light from the environment comes in and can brighten that shadow. The number 4 value is the core shadow value, and the number 3 value is the reflected light value. Now, I know in this live stream, we likely have many different levels of experience. So if you're unfamiliar with the core shadow and the reflected light, I'll share just a little about what these are before I get to the demo. So when we get to the shadow side of an object, we start to see the sphere go into shadow. It gets darker, but we have light that comes from the light source, hits the surface the sphere is resting upon, bounces up, and lights the bottom of the sphere. So we actually see the value get a little lighter right underneath the sphere. Now, this is still considered a shadow because it's not light directly from the light source. So you don't want to get confused about light versus shadow. So we have the core shadow at a number 4 value and the reflected light at a number 3 value. So that's it. 5 values. Number 1 highlight, number 2, midtone. Those are your values in the light. On the shadow side of the object, you have the core shadow at a number 4 value, reflected light at a number 3 value, and cast shadow at a number 5 value. Now, I will say at the beginning, value is much more complicated than this 5-step value scale. But at the beginning, when you are learning, and at the beginning stages of a drawing, you can think in terms of these 5 essential values to get the basic light and shadow patterns on the page. And later on, you can refine and add a lot more complexity.
Brent, we did have one question from Tuco here in the chat. He said,
Yes.
On a toned paper, which value would the color of the paper be itself?
It depends. So on this paper, as I kind of mentioned, so in the number 2 value is closest, but I have added a little bit of white. So I would say, you know, the value of the paper tends to be a mid-tone value, but it can differ slightly. So yeah, this and some of these papers, like, you know, this blue is a bit dark. On other paper, we have, it can be a little lighter. It may be a straight number 2 value.
Mm-hmm.
And I've done drawings on paper that is much darker. And so you could even have the value of the paper be a number 3 value or even a core shadow value. And of course, if you ever draw on black paper, which if you haven't done, I highly recommend.
It's an exercise. It really shows you what you don't know and how you've been applying one specific goal to your drawings. It's a good exercise.
Yeah, I love it. But you're literally drawing with light when you draw on black paper with white pencil. It's an incredible exercise.
I do like so 2 things here. There's one other question, but I do want to point out the movement of your value chart showing you not lifting your hand. This is good. This is a practical example.
Yes.
And then in here, Sammy Koo asked, can it be even simpler than 5 values? First, yes, absolutely. And the way that you split up your values, you can push them more towards light, more towards highlights, more towards shadows, and have this huge gap in the middle. There's some really interesting stuff you can do. Brent, I don't know if you wanted to address that in a further way.
Yeah, I mean, you can simplify a value scale, I mean, into 2 values if you want to. So I would say, though, that the goal is to make it functional for whatever it is you happen to be doing. And, you know, value scales are not just a random exercise, you know, they should be functional. And that's why, you know, I tend to use this 5-step value scale because it is so functional. It's simple, but highly functional. Because like I said, there's no filler here. Every single value corresponds to a specific light or shadow condition on the object that you're drawing. And everything else becomes refinement and subtlety later on.
There's one other question about value here that I think we should probably go ahead and get in before I abscond with myself.
Yes.
Mo Isa is asking, if I try to get a 2-tone, for example, but wrongfully push it more towards a 1, is it better to knock it back by erasing or try to move the grade 1 elsewhere further away? Do you think there's one answer to this?
No, I mean, I would say it really depends on the colors, depends on the materials you're using, and it depends on the ultimate effect that you wanna try. So I'm going to give a different answer than the one that to the question being asked. But, you know, with these kinds of specific questions, it's really critical to remember here that there are there's no one right way to do this. Experiment. You know, I tend to think of every drawing I do as nothing but practice for the next drawing. And in that sense, I'm free to experiment and try different things out in a way that allows me to fail if needs be. And, you know, in trying to answer things like that, yeah, I mean, part of it's just experimentation, just to see what's going to happen when you try things out. And it's okay. Remember, if you start a drawing, you don't know how to deal with something, and you completely destroy it, it's just a drawing. That's it. You don't get arrested. Your credit score doesn't go down. Nothing happens. It's just a drawing.
I mean, when I failed at in art school, it absolutely affected my credit score, Brent. I don't know if that's true.
Is that the policy these days? Okay.
Yeah. That's why all the art schools are still around.
Right. Well, that is a whole other conversation, but yes.
Okay, so I think that's it for questions for right now.
Okay,
Thank you so
great.
much.
So I did jump ahead here, but I want to lay out the basic process you're going to see me use while shading. So first, when I have a sphere here, like I start off with the basic shapes drawn, but the first step, you want to divide light from shadow. So as I mentioned before, when you're dealing with single source lighting, you're going to have everything that's being hit with light directly from the light source is considered lit. That's considered to be in the light. Anything that's not receiving light directly from the source is going to be in shadow. And so you want to create that division at the very beginning of your drawing. So you can see here, I have first added value in all of these shadow areas. And these aren't refined values at this point, but that's the first step, to add value in all of the shadow areas. So you want to keep this division between light and shadow throughout the entire life of the drawing. So, this line that divides light from shadow, it goes by many names. I think I've heard it referred to often as the terminator on Proko. I tend to say the line of termination, which is longer and less efficient, but that's the phrase I use. Some people call it the turning edge. Some people call it the bed bug line. But they're all referring to the same thing. They're referring to this moment where an object turns away from the light and goes into shadow. And there is some gradation there, but it's not as much of a gradation as you may think. So you can actually define it with a soft line. So yeah, that's the first step. Divide light from shadow. Next, I tend to darken any cast shadows just to establish that full range of values. So you can see here, I've darkened the cast shadow here. Now, I'm not attempting to capture each value perfectly. Remember, shading is a process. And one thing that people often don't think about when they're drawing is that drawing is a transparent medium. It's kind of like watercolor in that sense. You can see through each layer of lines you put down on the page, and you can see everything that's underneath it. So you layer values in drawing. So often I see particularly beginners trying to nail the exact right value the first time. Like, don't worry about it. It's a process. As long as you're organizing your values properly, you can always, you can usually make the drawing and the values work. So divide light from shadow, darken the cast shadow, and next I am darkening the core shadow. So these are the three essential shadow values. These are, from my perspective, these are the only values you really absolutely need in a drawing to get them to work. So here we have these three shadow values: cast shadow at a number 5 value, core shadow at a number 4 value, and reflected light at a number 3 value. So again, complexity can come later, but at first you want to simplify the values as much as possible. One of the things that I discourage is what I call shadow chasing. I've seen people shade, I can't even be called a process. Just wherever their eye falls, if there's a patch of darkness there, they just darken it in the drawing. And that's chaos. I highly recommend, particularly while you're learning, have a process. Have a process that you can stick to. The more experience you get, you can start to deviate from that process, but it is so much easier to have a process that you're working with that makes sense. So those are the first 3 steps of the shading process: divide light from shadow, darken the cast shadow, and then draw in the core shadow. That gives us our three essential shadow values. Next, once these values are starting to work, you can move into the light. And remember, there are only 2 values that we have in the light. We have number 1, our highlight value, and number 2, our midtone value. Now, if you are working with white pencil on toned or colored paper, I highly recommend taking your eraser and cleaning off any area where white pencil is going to be applied. even if you don't think that there's any pigment there. But as I was laying out these basic shapes, there are some errant lines with the pencil. White pencil is so delicate, so you don't want any dark lines to get in there. So I'm going to begin with what's known as the center light. So on a sphere, the part of the sphere that's facing the light source most directly is going to be brightest. And it's not going to be quite at a number 1 value, but it's going to be close. So I'm going to add some white pencil, and I'm going to let the light get dimmer as it approaches the line of termination. Now, this is a lighting effect that is so easy to miss. The highlight tends to get a lot of attention, but the surface of a curved object getting brighter as it approaches the light source is a subtle effect, but to me, it makes all the difference in a drawing. And then finally, we're going to place our highlight, the number 1 value, the only place in the drawing where I'm going to bear down on the tip of the pencil. So this is the shading process simplified. Again, I'm going to go through it one more time. You'll notice as a teacher, I tend to repeat a lot. This is because repetition really helps you get these ideas into your head. So the first step of the shading process, divide light from shadow. Find that line of termination that divides light from shadow, and then apply some value in all of the shadow areas. Next, darken that cast shadow to a number 5 value. So this will establish your darkest darks. Next, darken your core shadow at a number 4 value. And once you've done that, you can move on to the light. Now, I want to note that, this is not a refined drawing at this point. Refinement can come later. But so once you've got your shadows roughly in place, you've moved on to the light, you've drawn your center light, and you've drawn your highlight. The final phase of a drawing is refinement. And in my experience, refining a drawing can take about as much time as all of the previous steps combined. This is when you can start to really add complexity to a drawing. You can really focus on the shadow edges. For example, the edge at the line of termination should be a little softer and more diffused. So I can add some of that subtle shift in value. The line between, or the edge between the core shadow and the reflected light should be more diffused. So now I can go through and add that subtlety. I can pay attention to the edges of the cast shadow where it firms up right underneath the sphere, and the further away it gets, that cast shadow edge can start to soften. So I'm not going to take this drawing to a full state of refinement because I want to get to the figure, but I wanted to show you what this process looked like. So it's a 5-step value scale, and it's a simple shading process where you're dealing with each of the 5 values. It's so straightforward. It's such a streamlined and simple way to deal with the hyper complexity of light and shadow. Now, before I get to the figure drawing demonstration, Stephen, I just wanted to check in. Do we have any questions, any thoughts from you or the audience?
There are a couple questions here.
All right.
One that I think is probably the most important here. So PyBite asked, how do you differentiate cast shadows and ambient occlusion?
Okay, so
This is a deep one.
There is a very simple definition of cast shadow that I tend to stick with. So a cast shadow is anywhere where you have light blocked completely from hitting an adjacent surface. So when you get into much more subtle forms of light and shadow, I don't know that this is the answer that you're looking for, but I'm going to give you how I deal with some of these things. When you're studying drawing, and particularly figure drawing, there is an aspect to it that becomes so scientific. Like every shift in light and shadow does have a name. It can be measured. It can be, you can address it like that. For me, I tend to use a combination of technical knowledge, but then observational skills. So I will say that, in a drawing, the vast majority of the drawings that I do, and this is why I stick with this 5-step value scale, is because it deals with the essential shadows. If you get that kind of ambient occlusion, if you get it wrong, the number of people that are going to notice or care is so tiny. And it's the kind of thing where if you know how to observe well, then all of those subtle shifts in light and shadow that are outside of this more kind of essential range, you'll tend to pick up and draw them correctly, whether or not you can differentiate the names between them or not. Am I making sense?
No, I agree with this one. Yeah, like I think like you're saying here is that if you do all the cast shadows correctly, the ambient occlusion is just a natural part of it that follows.
Yeah. And again, it's in this live stream, I am focusing a little more just on I'm focusing on these essential values. And I'm saying if you get those right, that'll handle 95% of whatever it is that you need to do. And your drawing is going to be believable, your drawing is going to make sense, and it's going to be dynamic. So
I very much agree with this. Yeah, I think that's a succinct answer for this one. The other one here was from Darren asking, does the direction of strokes matter? What direction should the lines be when creating textures or making hatches?
Great question. So this will become a lot more relevant, and I will absolutely speak to this as we shift to the figure, which I will start to do now.
Okay.
So to answer the question, actually, really quickly on this sphere. So we tend to have a very natural kind of way the lines go with our hands. So if you're right-handed, you will tend to want to make roughly 45-degree strokes. This seems very natural. This is what I do a lot. And then it also can seem natural to, vary those strokes within, certain, to vary the angle of the strokes a little bit. Now, I would say that the direction of the specific strokes doesn't matter that much when you're layering them. So for example, as long as there are a few different kinds, like what you want to avoid is individual strokes popping out too much. So, when drawing this, I tend to start with this kind of stroke. I'll switch to this kind of, stroke. And once they start to layer, when each individual stroke becomes obscured, the specific directions are a little less important. I would say do what comes natural. Now, the reason I say, we'll talk about this a lot with figure drawing, is particularly when you are drawing in the light. So let me pull this drawing back in. When you're drawing in the light, when individual lines are going to stand out in their describing form, their direction actually matters quite a bit. So I would say, in areas like this, I'm thinking of it in terms of cross contour. I am thinking of these individual strokes. If they were extended, you can see that they're slightly curved and they are kind of depicting the underside of this muscle here.
For this one, I don't know if they'll have the fidelity with it to see it too much.
Right. Okay.
It might be worth showing just like a quick example on the other, like the sphere page, just for a cross contour. I guess.
Sure.
Like on a cylinder or something real quick.
Sure. I did come prepared with some extra additional drawings. Let's see.
It's like you've done this before.
So, all right. How about the fidelity here? These are much chunkier lines.
Definitely more visible.
Okay.
I think, and then those coming away from the core shadow on the sphere, I think are pretty visible.
Yeah, great. So here on the cylinder, and I'm going to draw right over this here. So if you imagine a cross contour, line traveling up and over the surface of the cylinder, you can see that the midtone lines follow exactly the angle of that line here. The core shadow lines, again, if you were to follow this angle, the core shadow lines are a different angle that correspond with that line going here. The reflected light lines also correspond with this line. So is that making sense? So as this line travels around, this band of where the midtone is, you can see where this line is. All of these lines follow that direction. So that's kind of a cross contour way of dealing with it. Similar with the sphere here, if you kind of think about, some cross contour lines kind of, traveling around the sphere, many of these lines tend to follow that cross contour.
Mm-hmm.
So if individual lines are visible, then drawing them in a cross contour fashion, I think works great.
Absolutely. Yeah. Some of the people who might have watched some of the materials on Proko, you'll have seen these described as like an explicit tool that you use in comic shading from some of our lessons from oh goodness. His name left my head. David Finch. He'll have shown these pretty explicitly. As a reminder to people, before we get into this full demo, I do want to remind everybody that we are here because Brent's course is now available on Proko. In case you guys don't know, that is the art and science of figure drawing. Brent's materials have been available on other websites before, but now they're on Proko. And let me tell you, Brent has been very communicative with students talking on that course, which isn't common for every instructor. Some people choose to have their lessons just be videos that people can pick up, and they just kind of watch them and let them speak for themselves. But Brent's been pretty great on there. So I appreciate that very much.
Yeah, of course. Excited to be here.
It's good to have another person with a different way of doing things rather than just Stan or Stephen Michael Houston. So, someone who's got like a real like this is where the serratus is and everything. I like someone just going like, you see it, you draw it, good.
Yeah, I mean, to be clear, I mean, I do study the anatomy. I do know it.
It's called the art and science for a reason.
Exactly. Yeah. But one thing I will say is that, again, like there are so many different audiences. There are so many different ways to approach these things. I would say that with the anatomy, I tend to have a learn it and forget it approach. So what I mean by that is I go through intense periods of study. We're here at my studio. We're here at the digital part of my studio, but downstairs I have skeletons. I've got, life-size muscular, medical anatomical aids that I study. And I've got, here's the small one that I have here. But I go through these periods of intense study and it kind of fills it all up, fills my mind up. But when I'm drawing, I'm actually not thinking that much in terms of, here's the latissimus dorsi coming in and here's the teres major. That's not how I tend to think about when I draw. That's not the primary way of thinking. The primary way I'm tending to think is in terms of the process that I've been talking about. So here you can see I've started with the very first step of the shading process. I am drawing the line of termination to divide light from shadow. Now, this is something you can do visually. Now, what I just said, I want to make a couple of things clear. I think studying anatomy is essential for anybody who wants to take the figure seriously. And very often, the line of termination, that moment where form goes from light into shadow, will follow anatomical form specifically. For example, this edge right here, that is the edge of the vastus lateralis. Like, knowing that can absolutely be helpful. This line, this is the edge of the latissimus dorsi. Knowing these things can be incredibly helpful. Here we have this is following the long head of the tricep. So
again, now you're just showing off. How dare you?
I'm saying you should know it, but I know that there's a certain part of the audience that at least wants to know that I know.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And but I also want to say, when I'm drawing, I think that focusing on the value and good observation skills. Well, let me put it like this. I know a lot of master figure drawings or master figure artists who have a passable knowledge of anatomy, but are absolutely masterful drawers. And because of their observational skills, they're able to get the anatomy in their drawings without necessarily knowing the names of everything. I also, so the very first anatomy class I taught in my 20s, had 9 students in it, and 8 of them were medical professionals. One was a surgeon, one was a dentist, one was a GP. They all had vastly more anatomical experience than I did, but none of them could draw. So I think this is a critical realization that you can be a master figure drawing with minimal knowledge of anatomy. But even if you have a surgeon's level of anatomical expertise, doesn't mean you'll be able to draw it. So take that for whatever it's worth. Again, anatomy is important, but I think good observational skills, a love of drawing, are sometimes more important. And hopefully that's not too controversial a statement.
No, I think you need a combination of both. Sometimes it's 80-20, sometimes it's 20-80, like which thing you're using.
Yeah.
So I guess, so now you're starting into your figure demo that you had been talking about.
Yes. So this first step that I'm engaging in is dividing light from shadow at the line of termination. Now, I did provide a reference photo for this pose. I know I sent that in. Would it be possible to get that somewhere on the screen so they can see what I am seeing?
Let me see what I can do in the meantime.
Okay. So
take myself off the screen here.
Sure. So the first step here is I am dividing light from shadow at the line of termination. So this is a simple line. It's not intended to capture every detail of the shadows yet. But again, everywhere in the upper left of the subject is being hit with light directly from the source. Everywhere in the lower right is going to be left in shadow. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add some value in all of the shadow areas just to make this separation between light and shadow. And I want you to see, this is now a 2-value drawing, right? That's it. This drawing now has 2 values. But even with these 2 values, the illusion of light and shadow does start to come out. Now, I know we just had somebody asking about the direction. And one thing I want to say is all of these shading lines that I'm drawing right now are eventually going to be layered over, and none of them are going to be visible at the end of the drawing. So they don't tend to matter quite as much. But as I said, it's when we start drawing in the light where the direction of line is going to start to matter a lot more. So now we have a very simple 2-value drawing. We have our light value, which is just left the color of the paper, and we have our shadow value, which if I pull over my value scale here, the shadow value is essentially a number 3 value. So one question I commonly get is, why a number 3 value? Why do we fill it in? And it's because this is the lightest possible shadow value that we're going to have. So it is easier to darken a value than it is to lighten it. To lighten a value in the shadow, you've got to get out your eraser, and lightening a shadow value is something you want to tend to avoid. It's difficult to do because once you lighten one part, it's unlikely to be even. So I like to start off with the lightest possible shadow value and go from there. So it's very easy to go dark. So this is a very simple first step. We have divided light from shadow on the main part of this subject using the line of termination, and then I have laid down a shadow value. So the next part of the process is we are going to start to darken the cast shadows. So where do we see cast shadows? Well, we see cast shadows here where we have the torso and the glutes casting a shadow onto this back leg. Now, one thing I want to note here is when you see me draw, these values are going to be rough, and they're going to be rough for a while. As I was mentioning before, you don't need to try and nail the exact value of whatever shadow you're drawing on the first pass. Remember, shading is a process of layering. So here we have a cast shadow. On this back arm here, which I'm going to sketch out really briefly, we also have some cast shadow. So now in areas like this where the subject is, this arm here is more in the background. I like them just to be ghosted in. Let me pull in a couple other finished drawings just so you can see how this works. This is something I use pretty frequently. In a drawing like this, this leg is going away from us and it's just ghosted in. So I really like these effects of thinking like a camera, where I have certain parts of the drawing that appear very finished, and those tend to come forward. Here again, you can see we talked about this before. This leg is further away and it's just ghosted in. And this creates a much greater sense of depth in a drawing, where we have, this leg in full detail, dark lines, it comes forward, this leg goes back in space. So I'm thinking about that even early on in the shading process. So I'm going to leave this arm that is further away from us just ghosted in. I'm going to add some darkened cast shadow here, but I'm going to quickly let that fade out. So here we have the first two steps of the shading process. We first divided light from shadow using the line of termination. We darkened all shadows to a number 3 value, which is our reflected light value. And then we've darkened the cast shadow to a number 5 value. And again, these are rough values at this point. Every drawing that you've seen so far, these finished drawings, this is what they look like at the beginning stages. They're not amazing drawings. They eventually look like this, but at the beginning, they look rough. The reason I bring this up is because it is so common with beginners that they feel a lot of pressure while they're in the process of drawing to make their drawings appear to be beautiful and finished. It's as if anybody were to pop in and see what they were doing in process at any stage, they would want their drawings to look, to look good, to look right, to look beautiful. And so I want you to let go of that concern. It's okay if your drawings don't pull together until the very end. Stephen, how are we doing over there? Any questions or comments? Or am I flying solo at this point? All right, that's okay. So
I think can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Sorry, it's a weird thing to bring in another image and not have it take over the full screen in here.
Okay.
Yeah. So so I have the image up here on screen for you. There's not too many questions here that have been built up too much yet. There was one comment from Mike Kalinowski. Said, "I'm a doctor and my knowledge of anatomy is deep. That said, I'm still learning to draw."
Yep.
Just kind of doubling down with what you said earlier.
Yeah. And again, it having that knowledge of anatomy can make it easier later on. I don't want to discount anybody's existing knowledge of anatomy, but Absolutely. I just think it's a fascinating thing. Yeah, there are master artists out there who have an okay knowledge of anatomy, but are still master drawers. Mm-hmm. And an extreme knowledge of anatomy is no guarantee that you can draw masterfully. So, all right.
I was going to say there are two other questions here that aren't necessarily strictly about where you are in the process right now.
Sure.
But would you want those?
Yeah, please.
All right. So these might actually kind of pair together. Because Quentin, as a younger guy, how do you get over the initial awkwardness of drawing naked people?
Do it a lot. The more you do it, the less it becomes something you even think about. And particularly if you're in live classes, I don't know if we can ask Quentin things. Has he attended a live figure class yet? Can we? That would be something I'd be curious about, because if you haven't, you'll be surprised. Even at the end of a one session, after you're in there with the same model up on the stand for a couple hours, like, you get used to it really quick. Mm-hmm. So that would be my recommendation. Do it a lot. If you're working from photos, it's the same thing. I will say that once you actually start the process of drawing, then your mind will start to focus almost entirely on the process in front of you. Once, this is a bit of a cliche, but as soon as you start thinking about value and form and structure and anatomy, it really, the human body does become the bowl of fruit. You cease to see it any other way. And because there's just not enough room in the mind to think about, nudity, the social implications of it, if you are thinking about the process of drawing.
I think it's fair. Sorry, there was a momentary awkwardness. The StreamYard's having a hard time managing all the different sources here. So there was a moment there where we lost one of the visuals.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a weird day for StreamYard. StreamYard, usually pretty reliable, but I agree. I think it's something, if you just go into it, jump into it, and do the thing, it's the best way to get through it.
Yeah.
There are two. Oh, no, you can go ahead, take this away.
Yeah, one quick thing. So I want to explain what I'm doing now, then I'd love to get back to some additional questions. So at this stage, I am now darkening the core shadow. And so you can see this is going to be our number 4 value. Now, the core shadow on the figure is an absolute thing of beauty. When we're looking at a sphere, the core shadow is, it is pretty simple. This relationship between the core shadow and the reflected light are simple, but when you start to see it on the figure, it's a thing of beauty. So here we have the core shadow that is following the insertion of the tricep here. We have a core shadow underneath the curved teres major. We have the core shadow here following the latissimus dorsi. And you can see right underneath, we get this gorgeous reflected light. We have light coming down, bouncing off of the leg of the model, and then lighting the underside of the torso. So, this is one of the reasons that I take my own reference photos, and I try and work with them to make sure these beautiful areas of reflected light are visible. So hopefully you can see that both in the drawing and in the reference photo. But, this takes a very complex area, and it's simplified into essentially, 2 values, right? You've got a core shadow and you've got the reflected light. But those two working together are so powerful in terms of what they start to communicate. So I just wanted to point that out. Also here, you can see on the glutes, we have this beautiful darkened core shadow, and then we have the reflected light coming from the environment that's starting to light. And again, it's very beautiful. So I think when you start to add the core shadow is when the drawing really starts to take on a new form of 3-dimensionality. And again, this is very simple, but hopefully it's starting to read on camera. This 3-dimensional effect. This is how you create the illusion of roundness on the flat surface of the page. That combination of that core shadow and the reflected light are going to do most of the work of creating that illusion. Okay, Stephen, so I'd love to hear now any other questions that we have.
Okay, so we have questions from what sound like some absolute beginners here. So
yep.
Tanya Smith asked, "It's my first time. I'm not a good artist. What's your advice?" And then Alareza said, "I know my question is kind of dumb, but how much time a day should we draw to be good at drawing? And how long does it take to get better?"
Yeah, so so some related questions. So what I would say is it really depends on what kind of artist you want to be. There are so many different paths you can take. One of the reasons that I fell in love with drawing is because it's such a fundamental skill. And, if you want to be a fashion designer, you got to learn to draw. You want to be an architect, drawing is a huge boon to that profession. You want to be in the entertainment industry. You want to be a digital artist or a traditional artist. Nearly all of these skills require a knowledge of drawing. So, you are exactly where you should be. And so I think a general knowledge of drawing combined with the specific skills of whatever field you're interested in is a great place to begin. But keeping a drawing practice, yeah, it's exactly what you should be doing. In terms of how often you should draw, I mean, that's such a difficult answer. I would say draw as much as you can. And the reason it's difficult is because we all have different lives. I don't know your situation. You know, if you have time to draw 8 hours a day, great, do that. If you've got a full-time job and kids and you can squeeze in a few hours a week, great, then do that. And I guess what I would say is any consistent practice will allow you to learn to draw, even if it's not hours and hours a day. And people draw for different reasons too. Like these kind of general answers can be a little tricky to work with because it really depends on your goals. Do you want to be a master figure artist? Are you happy just spending the time to take drawing and just spending time with the subject you love? Maybe you love botanicals. Like these are different paths. So draw when you can, draw what makes sense for your schedule. If you want to get good, I have perhaps a bit of an irresponsible answer.
Oh.
I would say draw to the detriment of other aspects of your life.
Okay.
Is that a terrible thing?
No. I can understand this because I think typically when someone goes and does something that they end up really good at, it's something that they do with the majority of their time, whether that's playing basketball or anything else that is even just a hobby,
Right. Yeah. And I would say that, when I was in the intense areas of study, like, I didn't have much of a social life. I'm terrible at parties anyway, but I wasn't going to parties. I wasn't, hanging out with friends. Like I tended to just stay at home and draw. And, I missed some experiences, because I was alone in my studio. But at this point, supporting my family and making a living and, having this skill, like I don't regret it at all. Just know that there are trade-offs, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the one thing that I would want to add in there, if you'll allow me, Brent,
Please.
is that for a person who doesn't have a lot of time, it can feel really kind of daunting. You feel like you should be doing the things that other people say online, where it's like, I drew 25 hours a day. If you just put in really focused practice and set a goal for yourself, like this week you're gonna really focus on trying to learn shading. Like not necessarily 1 week; these are all abstract concepts, but set a goal for yourself to learn one thing, and then hold yourself accountable to that. And then kind of check in there, give yourself a feedback loop of where your progress is and be honest. That'll do more than a person who draws 14 hours a day and they're just drawing 10 really detailed Gokus from Dragon Ball, They're just doubling down on their mistakes.
Right, absolutely. And I'm going to use that as a springboard to kind of jump back to the demo here. So this is one of my first jobs teaching drawing was I would be brought in to, like a middle school class and say, teach these kids to draw. You have 1 hour, period. That's it. And so much of the methods that I'm teaching come out of that kind of teaching experience where I have so little time, and it really forces you as an instructor to see, what actually works. Is this possible? And so, a lot of the things that you're seeing me do here, like this 5-step value scale, like, is this as impressive as, like a sphere that has like 14 values and each value has a name? No, but it works. It's simple. And to your point, Stephen, about, focused practice, like doing things like this is fantastic because the reality is when I'm drawing alone in my studio, I don't follow this process as I'm teaching it here. I'm a lot more chaotic, but this is how I learned. And because I learned this simplified process, it creates a highly functional mental model that I understand how light and shadow works, and it allows me to start to deviate and have more fun with the process because these values are so instilled in my mind, because I understand light and shadow so well. And remember, the alternative to having a mental model like this, where you have like, there's 5 values, there's 5 light and shadow conditions, here's the order I apply them in. The alternative is chaos, right? I mean, that's it. And this goes back to shadow chasing that I was talking about before. You know, again, I've seen so many people say, oh, here's this little, you know, patch of darkness. That's a shadow. I'm going to shade that in. And now my eye just happened to wander over here. Oh, there's another tiny patch of darkness. I'm going to put that in. That's chaos. That is the hardest possible way to draw. And so, you know, this is why I've focused so much with my teaching on these simplified models for how to think through light and shadow and how to think through a process, because they save time. You know, spending an hour doing this is probably worth 15 hours of just random, like, oh, I'm just gonna sketch whatever in my sketchbook and, you know, listen to a podcast while I'm doing it, right? So going
Is that
back,
something that you do, Brent? Do you have an art podcast?
I have a YouTube channel that I've recently started putting more videos into, and it's been a lot of fun.
You don't say. People can
I
find a link to
do.
that right here in the chat right now. A very good art
Fantastic.
channel. This is Evolve Your Art. You guys have probably seen Brent on there before, or at least been suggested the videos. It's a good channel. You guys should follow it.
Yeah, and I would say, so I was talking about single source lighting earlier. I actually have a whole video on single source lighting that shows you how to do it and what you're looking for. So, you know, it's the same method. I show it on basic objects, but it's the same method I use for figures. And I'm actually currently working on a video I'm really excited about drawing with white pencil on black paper. So
this was foreshadowing earlier.
Yeah, so I just wanted to show like what this looks like. I love these kinds of drawings, and this is such a great way to study how light and shadow work. And so yeah, if you haven't done this, you know, like, these are just in the studio here, but if you haven't gone through this process, it's a fantastic way. You have to know exactly how light works and to be able to do drawings like this.
Mm-hmm. I went to an event, like a local kind of like a draw at a bar kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And every single table in the place had white or tone paper put down on it, like a really light tone paper, tan. And then the people that I was hanging out with there, another Proko team member, Charlie, who people will have heard in Draftsman before, was there. And we were at a table that had black paper on it. And I had not come prepared for this. I had all like brush pens and things, and then just one whiteout that I had with me. And so between this one white pencil and some whiteout that I had to put a combination of highlights down. And it was a really interesting experience. You guys should try this.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. So going back to the demo, so Stephen, I know you originally said we'd go about an hour and a half. How terrible would it be if we went a little longer?
You can go for 3 hours if you need to. I'm here for it.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't know that I can go that long, but I'm a little behind where I wanted to be in this drawing at this point. So I'm thinking at least another half hour, if not a little longer.
No, this is fine. You said that you didn't drink that many liquids beforehand. I think you would go 3 hours if you needed to.
Maybe, yeah. So, all right. So I wanted to go back to where I am in the shading process. So I have done a first pass at all 3 values. I've got my number 5 cast shadow value where I'm bearing down with the tip of the pencil to the darkest value. There aren't that many cast shadows here, but there are certainly some. I've got my number 4 value, my core shadow value. And you can see that core shadow with that band of dark shadow that is running right here, right at the edge where the form of the figure goes from a light into shadow. And we have the reflected light value, the number 3 value. Now, as I said before, all of these values are going to end up being much more refined later on in the process. But so we have our 3 shadow values. Now I have started to shift into the light. So I was answering questions when I did this, but keen observers will remember that I pulled out an eraser and I started to clean out all of the areas where I wanted to apply white pencil before I added any white pencil. I wanted to make sure there was no pigment that was hanging out to get into that white pencil. The white pencil is very delicate. So I started with the white pencil, creating that center light where we can see the form was brighter up here where it's facing the light more directly, and tends to get progressively dimmer, as you can see down here, as it moves out of the light. And I started to just put a few highlights, and we have a highlight right up here on the deltoid muscle. We have a few highlights on some ribs here, and I think I'm going to hold off on those until a little later. But so at this stage, we have a simplified version of all of our light and shadow conditions, from our number 1 highlight value to our number 5 cast shadow value. Here's number 4, and you can see that, you know, if you look at the value scale, again, this is a very simple drawing, but it does correspond to these values, right? You can see them in real time, like how these values appear. So I have all 5 of my values at this point. So now we enter into the refinement part of the drawing. Now, for me, this is when, you know, this kind of drawing goes from simple to, you know, something closer to this, where we're adding in a much wider range of value. We're dealing with all of these anatomical details. But I want to state, you know, very, very clearly that this part, even though this looks rough, you know, this is the core of the shading experience. We have all of our values established, and no matter how refined or detailed this drawing gets, it will continue to correspond with these 5 values. The reason I think this is so important is because it is so common for students, once they start to deviate from these values, to start shadow chasing, to start saying, oh, here's a dark patch here, here's a light patch here, and just putting those values in without relating them to this. We want to maintain this, this value structure throughout the life of the drawing, no matter how detailed it gets. So any additional questions right now?
I think that the main question that we had was from Saucy asking, how do you decide which part of the drawing to emphasize and which part to not? Like how you didn't draw some parts of the body in your other drawings. It's beautiful.
Yes, so this is a very personal thing, but, you know, if you strip away all of the complexity, sort of, you know, going back to a drawing like this, if you strip away all the complexity, how I think about drawing is, this is my way of saying, hey, I thought this was really beautiful and interesting, and I thought you might find it beautiful and interesting too. Let me tell you about it through this drawing. And that's what it is. You know, so the most interesting parts, like, you know, I loved this bone of the elbow coming forward. Like, you know, I loved these shadows. I draw and emphasize what I think is most beautiful and interesting. And that tends to be, you know, I think my drawings are very much a record of that. So that's how I think about those things. The other thing, in a more technical sense, does have to do with bringing some things forward in space and pushing them back. So, you know, one of the things I often say in my classes is it's hard to imagine anything more flat than a sheet of paper. Right? A sheet of paper is pretty much the most flat thing you can imagine. And yet, as artists, it is our job to create the illusion of 3-dimensional form on the surface of this flat piece of paper. And so, you know, there are certain tools we can use to do that. And one of them is by emphasis. You know, we can use dark lines and a full range of values to pull some things forward in space, and use softer lines and a reduced value range to push other things back. And that's how you start to create that illusion of form. So it's a combination of those two things.
This is a good way to put this. There was one question I think that we didn't go into necessarily in full detail, but we kind of danced around earlier. Someone was asking when and how you'll choose to have something have a lost edge?
Yeah, so there are a few things. Okay, so this is a great question. I was hoping we would get to this, and I had a question mark whether or not I was going to go into it, but let's dive into it. So to define a lost edge, just for anybody who's unclear, we have the outer contour, the outline of the subject. And one of the things that I love in a drawing is line quality. And I try and vary my line quality as much as possible. I want all of these lines to stand out as being beautiful or interesting, and taking the opportunity to really say something about the subject. So as that relates to lost edges and line quality, we don't want the entire contour to be the same kind of line all the way around. We really want to have a wide variety of lines. So part of it's emphasis, right? So if I want, let's come down here to the patella. If I want this to look like hard bone, I'm going to use hard angular lines to depict that, right? Is that because it's what it looks like? No, I'm drawing in a way that's not only speaking to the eyes, but speaking to almost the fingertips. So these hard, dark lines, they tell the brain that's something that is hard. And as I pull the line up and kind of go into the legs here, I may use a thin but somewhat hard line to show like a muscle popping up. But this is a much lighter line, right? And so to me, these are different textures. It would feel, to knock on the patella would feel hard. To push here would feel taut. So I'm trying to create a line that looks taut. It's not soft, versus, some of these like fleshier parts, where this model doesn't have a huge amount of fleshier parts, but, there are areas where we can use, softer lines to communicate softness. So I like everywhere I look to have the values be communicating something to a viewer. The other way I tend to think about this is in the light. So, some of the darker contours that I have, so like right here under the armpit, right here under this arm, I'll darken this line. Some of these lines are in the darker areas of the drawing. But when we come up here to where we have the deltoid, you can see that up here, the line almost disappears. Now I may darken that a little, I may not, I don't know yet. But I tend to like to leave some of those areas less defined, because to me, it lets the light shine through. And in fact, one thing I'll often do at the end of a drawing is I'll actually extend the light beyond that just a little bit. It almost gives the effect that it's glowing a bit. That doesn't work if you've got a dark line running through there. The last thing I'll talk about, actually right here is a good opportunity, are overlaps. So right here we have the deltoid muscle coming in front of the trapezius, and I may darken that overlap just a little bit. And what this tells me is that this part of the muscle is coming in front of this. It creates an overlap. So we can, you can see that here as well. I have an overlap here as the leg comes in front of the torso. So I like to emphasize those moments sometimes to really get a sense of what's in front and behind. So, I'm giving you a number of different reasons here. I'm talking about value. I'm talking about tactile sensations we can create with line. But at the end of the day, I would say that just look for any reason you can to vary your line quality. And even if you don't have a specific reason, you don't want your drawings to sound like to look the way a monotone voice sounds, just kind of droning on. The more you can use different kinds of lines and marks, the more alive a drawing is going to become.
Absolutely. I think contrast is one of the most important things in art. It's not something that you should ever just let be there. Just a whole selection of grays. It's not as fun.
So now at this refinement stage, I wanted to address a few kind of specific things. So I wanted to bring your attention right over here to this area. So this is a really common issue I see with beginners. So right here, we can see the bulge of a muscle called the tensor fasciae lata. I'm bad with pronunciations. But you can see in the reference photo, there's a dark patch. Now, question for you. When you look at it, is that a shadow? Now, I know that you're not going to answer me like right now that in a way that I can hear you, but I see so many beginners think, there's a dark patch. That's a shadow. That is not a shadow. That area is a midtone. And this is such a critical thing because, you know, if we look at a sphere, if we were to look at a sphere, you know, that kind of darkness is right about at the midtone. At the moment, if that muscle were bulging a little more, it might go into shadow. But, you know, I would not draw that as a shadow. We draw it as a midtone, you know. So, you know, I just want to kind of put that out there. It's kind of the darkest possible midtone before we go into shadow. But, you know, I think those moments are really important. The same thing down here with the deltoid. And this is where we get into refinement. This is where we start to leave behind, you know, some of the specifics of the value scale that we've done. You know, there's not necessarily a number here. It's somewhere between a 3 and a 2 value. But, you know, I don't want you to think that every dark patch is a shadow. You know, it's not. There are these moments where we have these midtones come in and they almost look like shadows, but they are not. I would say here we have the iliotibial band. Now this is verging on shadow. You know, I would say that this part of the iliotibial band is closer to a core shadow value. But again, you'll notice that even as I'm dealing with the refinement, I'm still thinking in terms of this this more simplified value scale. And when I deviate from it, I'm thinking in terms of steps, right? And so this is what, when we start to add a lot more complexity to this kind of value scale, we can come in and say, okay, you know, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but now I can think in terms of a 2.5 or a 3.5. You know, so it's very easy to start to use this scale to add some complexity. So somebody earlier was asking about directions of lines. So you'll see that I'm using in this area of the tensor fasciae lata, these more subtle curved lines, because now we're in the light, the direction matters more. So I want to be able to justify the direction of some of these lines that we're drawing. So now we can see we're starting to add a lot more detail. Now, one thing that often happens during the refinement stage is I tend to darken the values overall. So right now, the three-dimensional form is really starting to come out. But at this part, I will often come in and start to darken areas of the core shadow closer to something like a number 4.5 value. And again, the initial value scale that we worked with is just a first pass. But now we can start to add all of this complexity.
I think, do you have some sort of gestures kind of thing turned on for doing other streams?
Do I?
Yeah, I think it seemed like something popped up on your stream. You did a motion. Yeah, there's some sort of like thumbs down thing happening.
Oh,
I don't know if that's a motion, a gesture trigger.
The camera must have. Yeah, I was not aware. Yeah, these are Logitech cameras. I guess they have something that's watching my gestures that did that. Strange.
The camera didn't like the drawing, apparently.
Yeah, did it do a thumbs down?
Yeah, it had like a thumbs down and a little like thought bubble kind of thing.
Oh my goodness gracious me.
Yeah,
Wow,
it doesn't approve.
Yeah, I guess not. My apologies. I'll have to check these settings on these cameras.
I'm okay. It was a little bit of spice, just a little bit of like cracked pepper on top of the video.
Yeah. So so one thing I'm doing here is I am softening the core shadow edge. So I'm letting some of the these lines and strokes pop into some of the midtone just to help soften it. Again, at this stage is all about refinements. Yeah, so this would be a great time, yeah, to answer any more questions. I'm at the stage of the drawing where, I'm starting to add a lot of subtle detail, which I'm happy to talk about to some degree. But yeah, this would also be a really great time to keep answering some additional questions about the process or about anything else as I kind of continue to add details.
We have one that's perfect for where you're at right now.
Yes.
Tony Dutz is asking. Someone did say this is a Mac camera thing, by the way, in the chat. Wouldn't know. Not a Mac user myself. But Tony Dutz said, "How do you smooth the transition between the light and the Terminator line?
Yeah,
Mine always
perfect.
feel too sharp on an edge, and I try to blend, but then it quickly gets too dark on the light side."
Yeah. So one thing I would say is that first, I am not doing that in this drawing, which feels really awkward. But I tend to get back from my drawings a lot. I would say that for every minute I'm spending in front of the drawing board drawing, I'm spending at least 10 seconds back. Like if there were a camera in my drawing, I don't know how far I would, or if there were a camera filming me, like, or tracking my steps while drawing, I would imagine I walk miles if I'm drawing for a few hours. I'm constantly getting back and forth. The reason I bring this up is because it looks so different when you're right in front of it versus when you get back 10 feet or 15 feet. And so I would say, make sure that you have that experience of getting away from your drawing. Make sure you have the experience of really backing up to see what these transitions look like from a distance. Because remember, the only person who's going to see the drawing at the closeness that you are is you, right? Very few people are going to get that close to the drawing.
There is one other situation where a person might see a very close detail shot of your drawing.
Yeah.
And I think that would probably be if they posted it on the notes on your course on proko.com/Eviston.
Yes.
For your review.
That was a clever transition, Stephen.
Thank you so much. I try my best. Yeah, if you guys want to get some sort of feedback on any of the things that you've done, there's some fine little detail area that you have. You're like, did I do the cross contour lines properly here? You can post as many images as you want of the things that you're working on. I mean, don't blow Brent up with all of your 40 different parts of your process across different posts. He's only going to reply so many times. He's got many drawings to make. But you guys can get that course right now at proko.com/Eviston. There are other questions if you're okay with taking them.
Please. And I'd love to, hear any feedback. It's always terrifying to do these live stream drawings because the reality is, not every drawing, even for professionals, not every drawing works out. So if anybody has if I've missed anything, I normally don't talk this much while drawing, or if there's anything specific somebody wants to see me handle in this drawing, let me know. And let me know if the drawing is reading and is working from where you are. So
there was a person here in the chat who did ask if there was a promo code. You don't need one. It's currently just on sale for a portion off right now. It's 25% off. You should go get it.
That is exciting. Yeah.
Thank you for the setup in the chat there, guys. I appreciate that. So this isn't about the process that if anyone has any specific things they want you to see you do, you guys should actually put something in the chat for this. But in the meantime, there was a question from Carlos Rue who was asking, how would you balance learning figure drawing and anatomy while you work on your own stuff, but also while you work? Like I do live caricature, but I also want to do convention prints.
So I have a bit of an odd answer to this question. So I tend to have a second life when it comes to drawing. I've always felt like I love figure drawing. I love traditional drawing, but I have this whole other kind of creative and experimental drawing practice that I also engage in. And the goals of those kinds of work are completely flipped. This kind of drawing is all about, can you create something beautiful, something that captures the technical aspects, but also the beautiful aspects of the figure. So if you have these different things you're doing, so I would say first, drawing the human figure is such a joy, and there's everything you want to learn about drawing, you will learn by drawing the human figure. It is an astounding and beautiful thing to draw. So but you've got to get used to kind of flipping your mind around in some different directions in order to master other skills. And so a lot of it just comes down to being able to make those shifts in your mind. What kind of project are you working on? What are the goals of that particular kind of artwork? When I'm doing my more kind of creative or experimental projects, it accesses a whole other part of my brain. But they're both drawing related, and so I do tend to find a lot of these crossovers between the two. But yeah, just figure out where they're similar, and you can focus a huge amount of your practice on the similarities, but also being able to shift back and forth between the differing goals of different kinds of artwork and projects. Am I making any sense?
I think so. Yeah. No, it's like you said, it's not that it's like a 1-for-1 kind of balance. It's finding that balance.
Right.
Everyone's journey in that one will be a little bit different.
Yeah. And was there a second question that I completely neglected to answer there,
No,
Stephen?
no, I think they just expanded a little bit on what their specific situation was, where they were trying to do caricature while also trying to learn a little bit more. I don't think you missed that one in there. I think you addressed it.
Yeah, I mean, any time you're drawing, you're going to be learning. And caricature still is based on the same basic rules of this kind of drawing. You just get to exaggerate them more. I mean, that's what it comes down to, right? But you're not working within like a different idea of value or a different idea of form or a different idea of anatomy. It's just exaggerated. And so, and actually this brings me, like one thing I would say, and please don't do this, but if you were to take my drawing and overlay it, over the drawing you're seeing here, like there are all kinds of places where it would deviate, right? I think the torso is kind of curved a little differently. There's more angularity here. And, this leg is extended back further. And so even when you're dealing with figure drawing, I'm intentionally exaggerating. I'm kind of taking this pose and kind of amping up the dynamism by maybe something like 10%, right? And so, that's something you're always doing. That's exactly what you're doing in caricature. You're choosing to exaggerate, certain things. And, you can still practice that, but just with some different goals. So. All right.
There's some disparate kind of questions in here. No one's giving any suggestions on what they want to see you do with this piece.
Okay.
But I was actually kind of curious. What kind of things would you expect to get if that was someone's real focus for trying to come up with a question for you? What would you be most likely to imagine someone asking for seeing you demo here?
Sure. Maybe some of like the really subtle aspects of anatomy.
Okay.
So, I think like once all of the values are working, and once the drawing is getting to, this kind of a point, you can start to get into some of those really kind of nitty gritty specific anatomical structures and forms. But, I will say that at the beginning, of a drawing, and this is a really common issue that I see with a lot of beginners, like they get too detailed too quickly, or they get too caught up in minutia way too early. And, if you have some patience, and you're able to bring your drawing, to this kind of level here, now is the time that you can start to deal with all of the anatomical minutia. And so you can see now I'm starting to deal with like these beautiful subtle midtones that are in the torso. I've started to delineate, a few of the ribs, and these are just barely, like this is a technique I have to refer to as soft hatching. I am using, they are hatch marks, but they are these incredibly soft edged hatch marks. So they read as individual lines and strokes.
Is this a phrase that you have trademarked? Is this going to be, someone goes to search this up, will they only get directed to BrentEviston.com?
Oh, that's a great question. So I never like, this is how I have used, like how I think about it when I do it. I don't think I'm quite clever enough to have invented a whole other, art term. But but maybe it's possible. But yeah, at BrentEviston.com, you'll be able to find all kinds of additional drawing resources, access to other courses, promo codes, all kinds of things. So
there you go. Thank you for following on the the segue there. I appreciate that.
yeah, and learn about the new trend of soft hatching. You've heard it here first.
So did you want to get some of these really disparate questions? I think it would be
Yeah,
really
yeah,
easy for them to kind of lead off into too many directions.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that as an instructor, I'm handling the parts of the drawings that people want to see, and that I am here to serve your audience and to provide value. So if there's anything that I can do, whether it's related to this drawing or not, I'm happy to do that.
Okay. I appreciate that. All right. So first and foremost, this is a comment from much earlier in the stream that I think we should probably get out here.
All right, yes.
Owl Polar said, Brent is responsible for so many people starting figure drawing. Thank you. Just want to make sure that one was
up. Well, that's lovely. Okay.
There was nothing more. You were waiting for more in there. No, it's just saying you're awesome. Thank you for what you do.
Yeah, of course. When I was younger and trying to figure out my life, and at times living out of my car in Los Angeles, like, it is hard to imagine being here and being able to share my love of drawing with so many people. And like, it is an absolute joy and a pleasure. And one of the reasons I really try and find these ways of teaching that really connect with people is because, like, it is an absolute privilege to be doing this. Mm-hmm. And so to hear that it's connecting with people, that my love of drawing is making a difference and I'm connecting, there are few better feelings to have. There are few better ways. It makes meaningful, this meaningful work truly worth doing. So thank you.
Absolutely. All right. So Tilsgy asked about midtones earlier. How do you know which part of a drawing is in shadow and which part is midtones?
Yes. So I always go back to, spheres and basic forms. So remember, the first thing is to figure out if something is in the light or in shadow. Like, that's the first critical thing you need to figure out. And so again, this is a simple, quick drawing I did earlier, but any part of the subject that is being hit with light directly from the light source is lit and not in shadow. So that's a really simple definition. Now, one thing I made a big deal about earlier, and I haven't talked about in a while, is the idea of single source lighting. So remember, all of this is dependent on good lighting on your subject. So, if you light an object with a single light source, it creates this full range of values. So there's this moment where you have the form curve away from the light and go into shadow, right? And so right before that line of termination, you've got that midtone. Now, so I'm going to answer this question in a couple of different ways. There's, how do you tell, like, when you're observing something, if something is a midtone or not? And then there's, how do you draw it? Like, when you're drawing, do you draw something in a midtone value? So here is a good rule of thumb. And this goes back to a question about really specific ideas about shadow earlier. But once you know these 5 light and shadow conditions, the highlight, the midtone, center light, the core shadow, cast shadow, reflected light. Once you know those, I have a rule. If I can't identify it, I don't draw it. And so, and again, I don't take it as far as all of the, like, the more subtle things that come later on. But with those 5 values, like, nearly everything's going to be one of those, right? There are subcategories, and as we were talking about earlier, like, there are different kinds of cast shadows. But if you can't identify it, then don't draw it. And also, if you have a working value scale, it can actually be pretty easy when you start comparing values. So let me go back to this drawing here and show you an area that's coming to mind. So yeah, like this area right here. Now, if you look, so this is right underneath the iliotibial band. We have a bit of the vastus lateralis peeking out, right? Now, this looks dark, right? Is it a shadow? No, this is a midtone. Now, it's about as dark of a midtone as you can get before you truly go into the shadow. But if we have this core shadow right next to it, we can see what a number 4 core shadow value really looks like, right? And it is considerably lighter than that core shadow value. So, that's something I would start to think about. And also, dealing with a lot of 3-dimensional form, things become really apparent. So right here we have, this is about a core shadow value. And this part of the iliotibial band, like it does flatten out a bit, but it lights very similar to a cylinder, right? We've got this sort of brighter value closer to the light source. We have a mid-tone that's just left the color of the paper. And then we have that core shadow value here, right? So, and it lights, if we were able to isolate that little section, it would light just like a cylinder. So thinking about it in terms of simplified 3-dimensional forms, I think really can start to go a long way.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think going down to simple, like your basic primitive forms, it's so important. People, they kind of forget it sometimes when they get further along in their art journey. It's a bummer.
Yeah, and on that note, like if you think about this leg overall, if we just kind of isolate it, like it pretty much lights like a cylinder, with the exception of that iliotibial band popping on. We've got, the center light, the mid-tone, we've got this core shadow, and then we have the reflected light, right? I mean, it is, hold on, let me grab a cylinder drawing somewhere here, but, it lights just like this, right? I mean, if we look at this cylinder and we look at this leg, same shadow pattern, light, light, mid-tone, mid-tone, core shadow, reflected light, right? And so, this is why I spend so much time teaching students these more basic forms, because you can solve nearly any light and shadow problem if you understand spheres, cylinders, and cubes. It's astounding what you can do.
So. There was a question. I thought this is actually a pretty interesting one to me.
Yes.
From Isaiah here in the chat. At least I think. Yeah. They asked, how would you go about making him feel heavier visually?
Heavier visually. Okay.
Yeah.
So now, first of all, I will state that this is not a particular, like I'm not quite focusing on that. That being said, I'm happy to answer it. So earlier in this live stream, I talked about tactile lines to communicate feelings, right? So for example, if you want, a patella to look hard, then I'm using these hard, sharp, angular lines, right? It communicates more to the fingertips than it does to the eyes alone. And so you can use the words you use to describe lines can start to work to describe physical sensation. So if I wanted to ground this figure, let's say, right, then I could start to draw some dark, heavy lines where the foot is coming into contact with the ground plane. Now, here are a couple critical notes about this, right? Obviously, some of what we're doing relates to observational drawing, right? But we are not beholden to only draw what we see. In fact, I think a drawing that only depicts what is visibly observable kind of misses the point of drawing altogether. We can take the opportunity to communicate with line and mark. So heavy lines start to depict weight. And in fact, you see at the reference photo, like, right underneath the toe here, I don't see any dark, heavy lines, but I can draw them anyway to really start to suggest kind of weight and heft, and that starts to ground the figure. Another thing I will, do, we can add a cast shadow down here, and I can push it beyond, like what's visible to actually kind of, create a grounding in the figure, to create a visual weight, underneath. So as soon as we do that, and again, like I'm doing this like pretty rough and raw here. Like, this is not observational drawing anymore. I'm adding visual weight that starts to weigh down and ground the figure, right? Another thing we could do is kind of following this leg down. We might want to push the verticality, right? So I can draw lines that are straighter and heavier that send the eye down, right? They kind of, I mean, you almost want to visualize arrows. You're telling the eye, go down, gravity is at play. and so you can start to, use those kinds of strokes to send the eye in particular directions.
I'm
And
just over here nodding so hard right now because you're hitting every single point in this so beautifully right now. I couldn't agree more with every single thing you're saying.
yeah, and again, like when we talk about visual weight, like again, watch, if you watch this, if your goal in a drawing is to imply visual weight, somebody early asked about emphasis, like then you could bring a huge amount of like dark lines and marks to this area, and you can watch it get heavier and heavier as you add value. And if you really wanted to push the concept, you may even deviate from value altogether and even start to create visual weight that's not even there by adding value. Remember, value is heavy. Value appears visually heavy.
Yeah, and if you actually are able to see details of something, you can kind of think about it as how you see something in media, in a movie or something. If you can see a crisp edge to something, that means it's not moving.
Right.
There's no motion blur to anything. The same thing applies to our eyes. So
Yep.
the other way that you can kind of approach something like this is thinking of it in almost adversarial way to what you're seeing. So right now, there's almost this like, I don't know, like ineffable quality kind of thing that's going on here where things are being thrown into the background. And that, like you were talking about earlier, kind of applies or implies some motion, some movement, along with implying depth. If you see all of those details and everything's making contact and there's full darkness, that means it's not moving. And that by its very nature says heavy in much more of a way than something moving quickly.
Right. Yeah, it says stable, and it almost implies that it's not moving, perhaps because it can't move because it's so heavy.
Exactly. Thank you for letting me like shoot off at the mouth there. I just love that concept so much.
Yeah, and this idea again, like I feel like students often have to be reminded, our goal is not to faithfully replicate what we observe. That is not our goal as artists. Now, it's not a bad goal when you're first starting to learn, but again, this is why earlier on, if for those of you who haven't been here the whole time, I look at a drawing as my way of saying, I thought this was beautiful and interesting, and I thought you might find it beautiful and interesting too. And I'm going to make a decision to emphasize the things that I think are beautiful and interesting, whether or not I observe those things or not in the actual subject.
I think that there's probably one other place that people can find out about what you find beautiful and what you've wanted to communicate in the past. I think that would be your YouTube channel.
Yes.
So here in the chat, I'm going to drop a link for you guys. You can see a whole bunch of stuff that Brent has thought was beautiful, wanted to share with you before, and to teach you over at Evolve Your Art. Brent's a great teacher and has done a fantastic job of getting to share what he's appreciated most in art and what he feels is most important.
Yeah, and it's very much geared toward students. I have tried in my career to figure out what truly resonates with students while they're learning. And I remember being alone in my room years ago, just loving drawing, but just saying there's so much information out there. And for many of you, I'm sure you're finding that there's so much different information out there. There's so much of it that conflicts. Where do you begin? Where do you start? What teachers do you listen to? What teachers do you ignore? What's going to create good drawings in the moment, but is actually going to cause you to create bad habits later on? Like, these are very difficult things to sort out when you're a beginner. And so I've really, like, I remember being in that position. I try to create content that simplifies these processes, that really connects with people in a way that they can, utilize these techniques. So, I'm kind of reaching a point in this drawing where if I were alone in my studio drawing, away from the eyes of students, at this point, I would put the drawing away and I'd come back to it with fresh eyes. And so I try and make some distinctions. And, that is such a great way to, to approach drawing at this stage, because you're not going to notice everything, depending on my mood, depending on what I had for breakfast. I may be noticing, different kinds of things on different days when I And so, yeah, getting some space from a drawing, I think, is a really great thing. So, we should probably wrap up here pretty soon. So if anybody has any additional questions, I'd love to hear them. And again, like, how is this drawing reading? It's a little hard to tell. I'm looking on the screen. It looks a little different than it looks in front of me. But yeah, is this reading? Is this been useful for students? Is there?
I'm asking them here in the chat. We'll see what they say. I do want to say, for anyone who wants to, revisit this piece with Brent later, getting that kind of like objective distance on something, we kind of plan to do a few streams like in support of this course, correct?
Yes, I'll be doing I think at least 4 more where I'll be doing some live critiques. So yeah, if you want to talk about that a little, sure.
Yeah. So if you guys want to see Brent revisit something and talk about something with some little objective distance, that's a great way to do it. If you guys want to be notified of those things that are coming up in the future, you can subscribe, get notified here on the channel, on Twitter, Facebook, wherever you're watching this thing. Follow there. But you can also learn a whole bunch more about it on Proko by following Brent or picking up the course this comes from at proko.com/Eviston. But you guys should also follow Brent himself on YouTube. That's going to be the channel. I always drop the name of the actual channel. So you can just type in Brent Eviston, or goodness, I lose it every time. Evolve Your Art.
There you go.
It just won't stick, man. I can't.
Well, I love the idea of evolution in art, just because that's what it feels like, right? You're small iterations over time equal incredible results. And there's so much pressure when you're starting off to make so much progress so quickly, but that's not what it's about. If you just improve 0.5%, a week, then over time that all adds up and you can make some incredible progress. So at this point, like I said, I would get some distance from this demo drawing. I think it's starting to work out pretty well. One challenge I think I'm running up against, kind of looking at it on the screen a little bit, is I don't know how much the highlights are coming through with the fidelity of the camera. But yeah, I wanted to talk about finishing things up. So I'm going to take a break from that previous drawing. Hopefully you all think it's working out. Again, if you want to see me do anything else to it, please let me know. But I wanted to start to talk about a few things. So at this stage in a drawing, I often like to create what I refer to as like atmosphere in the drawing. And so you'll see, like, I have all of these lines and marks that I think start to imply motion. They add some value. This drawing has actually been grounded a little more, so hopefully you can feel a bit of weight being pushed down into that foot. But so again, I love all of these lines and marks that start to simulate, maybe a motion path of the figure. There are value lines here that start to push this leg back into the distance. And for a much more extreme version of this, I'll pull this drawing back in. But so, this drawing, I took quite a bit of time from and came back, and it just felt like I wanted to create this flurry of lines and marks in the background. And so again, is this something I observed? No, but I wanted to create a visual experience. It was a little more dynamic and exciting. It can be a little horrifying near the end of a drawing to just come in with a pencil and start doing this everywhere. It doesn't always work out, but this one, I think it worked out okay. And so, but I just want to talk about the finishing a drawing. And even on this darker paper, the highlights and the center lights are very subtle. There's not a huge amount there. It's really easy to go overboard with white pencil, but you want to tend to use it in pretty subtle ways. You don't want to go overboard. You don't want to add too much.
Make it mean something.
Yeah, absolutely. Do we have any additional questions, Stephen?
Everyone's only said positive things here. I put a call out for finding out how it's reading for people.
Okay.
They've said exclusively positive things. I think that there was some people asking about how to learn anatomy. It is something that we covered a little bit earlier in the stream, like the balance. I don't think that we should necessarily revisit that one right now. But
no, let me just a little, because I've come prepared, Stephen.
Oh,
so I do this exercise, I don't know, once every few years, but make your own anatomical drawings. So here I have a very simple line version, like I'm in process. And again, I'd like to give people like a realistic sense. There is so much to remember. And so every few years, I start to do my very own anatomical drawings just for myself. And this is going to sound really nerdy, but as I draw, I literally say to myself, verbalize out loud, latissimus dorsi, latissimus dorsi, latissimus dorsi, deltoid, 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 deltoid. I'm talking myself through it as I'm drawing muscle fibers, like serratus, serratus, serratus. So, do your own drawings, and while you're doing it, verbalize the muscles. So you can't help but remember a lot of these as you're doing things like that. So this is absolutely a way that I would recommend to start to study and learn anatomy. And yeah, this process. There are a lot of great anatomy books out there, and so I tend to work with different ones because they all have different takes on the same subjects. But hopefully this will give a sense of like how you can start to learn. The other thing I would often say with learning anatomy, I'm sorry, Stephen, you said we shouldn't go there. But,
No. I didn't want to make you revisit a thing.
Oh,
but
okay,
if you want to, go for it.
Yeah. So one thing that people often don't think about is you have one of these. Like all of these, like you have right now. And so, poke around your own body, like, get an anatomy book and like, see what happens. Like, with pectoralis, muscles, like they pull the humerus in, like do that. See how it changes. And one thing the anatomy books don't get across is how the shapes of these muscles change. But yeah, you have you have the most elite and complex and realistic anatomical model you could possibly ever want. Like right now, you're sitting inside of it right now. So take advantage of that. Explore your own body to see what's in there. And that, and combined with doing your own anatomical sketches, is fantastic. So.
I agree. Another way to really see muscles in motion, if you're trying to figure that out, because again, that's a massive thing, is do your stretches.
Yeah.
Just look at it, because you can't do anything else while you're doing those stretches. Look at your muscles. Observe them.
Yeah.
Because you guys need to do stretches and you need to look at your references. In there, the one thing that people in this chat really want to make sure that you talk about is the striking that balance for anatomy. Like how deep do you think the anatomy knowledge has to be at any given time while you're drawing?
Yeah, so it depends on what you're doing, but for the most part, the goal of this drawing for me is not to accurately represent anatomy. I hope that no anatomy is so far off that people who know look at that and say that's not possible. But it's not the goal. Like, the experience of figure drawing is really all about partaking in the beauty of the human form. It's about our shared humanity. It's about feeling something, right? And so at the end of the day, like I feel something when I view these drawings, and when I make a drawing, like, and I want to impart some of that feeling in the drawing. So I am much more interested in imparting feeling and to create a beautiful and dynamic experience for the people who are looking at my drawings than I am in accurately representing every anatomical feature. Now, I imagine there are figure drawers out there who would hear me say this and be appalled and think I've got it all wrong and backwards, and that's fine. We all have our different reasons for drawing. But so, so striking that balance can be a challenge, but unless you're doing scientific illustration, you don't want your drawings to look like a scientific illustration, right?
Yeah.
You want the viewer to feel something. And so I would say I often sacrifice, anatomical accuracy for dynamism or for something beautiful to occur in a drawing.
Yeah, so. To really add like an example to what you said about it being one for like depending on the purpose, and to consider the result that you're getting from this, whether it has life to it. Is Stan cites this thing where when he was first drawing, and really getting into art. The career path that he was considering was trying to go into animation, but he went to a school that was pretty technical, you know. And so in the what was supposed to be an animation portfolio, he had a bunch of very rigid anatomy renderings. Like, so obviously the man got rejected because this doesn't show a love for having something move, and even the drawings themselves don't have any movement to them, you know, like by their very nature. So just know what you're aiming for on every level that applies to.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. And that being said, you know, if your thing is highly complex and realistic anatomical drawings, then don't listen to me. Like,
yeah,
just
freaking
go
do
do
them.
that thing. Just do it.
Yeah, yeah,
Doesn't matter.
and then you get to go and put on the course page, like, because or whatever page where you're publishing your things, you say a quote from Brent Eviston, and you say, "Don't listen to this," and you put a red line through it. That's
That's
totally
right.
fine.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah, we should all be attacking each other all the time as artists, is what Stephen is saying.
Is there anything that you want to kind of like wrap up with here before we
Yeah.
head out?
I want to, you know, thank the Proko team. You've all been wonderful to work with, and this has been a great opportunity. You know, I get a high off of sharing my love of drawing like nothing else. So this has been really wonderful. And you know, I hope this has been useful for students. And you know, if you've gotten something out of this, yeah, please go check out my website. And please come back for the additional live streams we'll be doing where I'll be critiquing work and doing more drawing. So yeah, any final things you think we should wrap up with, Stephen?
I think that's the main thing for me, except for to remind people that everything that you've seen here today is all just one small example of what's included in that full course from Brent that's now on sale for 25% off over on Proko. There's a link in this chat here that's pinned up at the top. There's also a link in the description. There's a link on screen. You guys choose whether you want to type it or click it or anything like that. Thank you for being here, Brent. This has been wonderful.
Yeah. Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, it's been great. And I will say the one last thing, you know, in those courses, I really try to have my love of drawing come through. And I really remember being a beginning student, and those courses were designed for you. I know what it's like. I've been there, and I try to create courses that provided what I wish I would have had when I was starting off. And so I've really worked to provide, to demystify the process, to take complex ideas and simplify them into actionable concepts. So I hope to see you there, and yeah, I hope this has been valuable.
It's been great. Everybody, we will be back here again in the future. So keep an eye out. We'll see you again later.
All right. Thank you so much.